it. But that was always kind of in the back of the mind, that, what happens, what will happen to our kids? What will this do to them? And here somebody just really drove that into me. And I had a hard time getting it out of my head. And we joked a lot about it. People, almost everywhere we went, everybody would say, were you taking those little kids with you? I used to say, I get so tired of hearing that. I would say, yeah, no, you want them? And nobody took me up on that. But always, we kind of make light of it and work through that and all that. But always in the back of my mind, that just grated on me. Are we really doing the right thing for them? We got to Zambia. And it was kind of a whirlwind experience. We landed in Lusaka, the capital. We spent a night there. The next day they assigned me, I believe it was the next day, it might have been 2 nights, I can't remember, but we were assigned a vehicle. It was an old Nissan van. We loaded all of our junk, all of our luggage, and our kids in the van, and we followed another missionary family out all the way on the other side of Zambia, right on the Malawi border, to a town called Chapata, which was going to be the place where we did language study. A long drive. It probably took 9 or 10 hours for us to get there. It was after dark, 8, 9 o'clock at night. And we pull up, this is what's going to be our new home, and it's dark. We can't really see much about it, but we see there's a big steel gate that had to open. There was like 8-foot walls all the way around it with glass on top. And you kind of wonder, you don't have to wonder too long what that's about. And you went into the house. The house was nicely furnished. It's a very different kind of house than we were used to, and it had a different feel about it. We were exhausted. We were still having jet lag, and I'd been driving all that time, and very nervous because of driving on the wrong side of the road and all of that stuff like we did there. And we got, finally, in the family that we followed out, they had little kids, so they couldn't stay with us very long. They had to get their kids home and get them to bed. They kind of showed us the ropes of the house and where everything was, how to lock up, and said they'd see us in the morning, and they left us. It was the hottest time of the year, and so it was probably 85 or 90 in the house. We tried to lay down and go to sleep, and we just couldn't. So I said, well, I'm going to have to, open the windows. And so I got up and opened the windows and kind of let a breeze come in. We didn't have any fans, laid back down and went to sleep. I didn't bother to look when I opened the windows to see if there were screens on the windows. That's just something you don't check here. You just kind of open a window and just assume that everything's taken care of. Got up the next morning and to find there were no screens on the windows. And the house that we were living in was near a kind of a swamp, and so there was a huge population of mosquitoes. And during the night when we slept, the mosquitoes were coming in the house, and we were all getting bitten and bitten and bitten. Mosquito bites there didn't hurt like they do here. Wouldn't feel them as much as these little things you have here really hurt. Those didn't. And those would kill you, but they didn't hurt when they bit you. But we got up the next morning, and all of us had mosquito bites and went into the bedroom with the kids, and our daughter, well, this bothers me. I've told this story 1,000,000 times to different people, but her face was just so swollen with the mosquito bites. Her eyes were almost swollen shut. We'd had all these lectures talking about malaria, and the another thing that stuck out in my mind more than anything is the best way to avoid getting malaria is don't get bitten by a mosquito. That wasn't real helpful at that moment. We'd all been bitten, and she had just been really, really, really eaten up with them. Well, I did what I could. I went out and found some screens that I could buy, and I just taped that onto the windows where we could have the windows open at night and have some air without the mosquitoes coming in, and fixed our bedroom windows like that so we could at least have that done. And we were really scared. That scared us. And about a week or so after that, Michelle and Michael woke up with a 102-degree temperature, and we just assumed they had malaria. So we went to missionaries that were working with us there, and they told us the best medical care in this area is a Seventh-day Adventist mission station that's about an hour from where we lived, and they said it's very good medical care. It's the best thing in the area, and probably one of the best places in the country to get medical care. And so we loaded up and found our way out there, and ended up going in. We managed to get in. And the first thing that happened was we went in to get the fingers pricked so they could take blood and make a screen to see about if they had malaria parasites in their blood. And went in, and it took a long time to get in there. Went through a bunch of stuff, and then Got there, and there's a guy sitting behind a desk, and we told him we needed a malaria test, and he said, okay, and he reached out and picked a lancet up off the table, poked my son's finger with it. And just as that happened, it just occurred to me that thing was not in a wrapper or anything. One of the things that we'd heard so much that we had to be extremely careful about in sub-Saharan Africa was that AIDS was spreading just rampantly, and needles and stuff like that. And then that happened. And then he took my daughter's finger, and we said, no, this has to be a clean one. Don't you have something in the paper or something like that? He got pretty upset about that because he didn't want to waste it, but he took it out and he pricked her finger. And so that just kind of horrified us. We just let this happen. We went out and waited for a few hours and finally figured out the ropes of how to get in to see a doctor. And we got in. Then finally they called her name, and we went into a little room. It's about the size, a little open or foyer kind of thing. It's about the size of my office. It's maybe 8 or so feet wide and maybe 15 feet long. And it had 3 doors on each side. And then the door that came into it, and that was the only openings. There were no windows or anything. It had a very dull bulb that was hanging in the top. And they called her name, and they got up and they opened this door, and we walked in. And we went into that little corridor, and it was just packed full of people. And people, we assumed they were sick. They were at a hospital. They were there for something. They were coming to see a doctor. And so we were standing there holding our kids, waiting for one of those doors to open. When the door opened, you had this whole crowd of people in there that was just rushed for that door. And somebody made it in. Everybody else backed off. And we sat and watched that happen for a while. And I thought, good grief, this is just survival of the fittest. It's whoever. And I looked around. I was the biggest person in the room. The Africans from that area are really fairly small people. And so I said, okay, I'm no more being humble and nice. We were holding the kids, and we were waiting and waiting and waiting. And so I looked at which door had not opened yet, and we kind of maneuvered over by it. It opened up, and I used to be a fullback in high school, and I went back into that mode. I got through the line and got in there, and it just happened to be an American, one of the mission doctors from America, whose door we went through. He was a very nice guy. He was very helpful, and he sent out to go get the test that they'd done for the malaria. And we found out that the kids did not have malaria. He said they have a virus or some kind of flu or something, and he gave us some stuff for that. And we drove home relieved that the malaria hadn't happened. But it was a tremendous burden that we had just experienced the best medical care in the region and possibly in the country. All the possibilities of sickness and snake bites, and that was not going to be helpful. And it was very concerning. And I just had to know from that point, if we were going to stay in the country, if we were going to see it through, we had to know and believe and just live with the fact that Jesus was with us. And the only things that would come to us were the things that he would allow, and he could see it through it. I could tell a whole bunch of stories about all the things that God did, and how with our family he revealed himself and showed himself with us. But just to come to the end of it, we came from our 30 years in Africa, having raised our kids there. We have 3 children that are functional and working, and we have 7 wonderful grandkids as a result. And God saw us through that. And we can just see in all those different things, all those different experiences, all the different times that things happened, and then sickness did come, and we all had malaria. And our youngest son, we had a doctor tell us if he got it one more time, there's no way we could stay on the field. He never had it again. God just was with us. And we can see that so clearly on this side. But it's not just because our story had a happy ending that we can know that. God was with a lot of people that experienced horrid losses. We had friends. I don't have time to tell you their stories, and they're stories I shouldn't tell them anyway. We had a friend who lost a son who had asthma. He was in Kenya, and the boy had an attack, and he was trying to drive him to the hospital, and then he found out that he wasn't going to make it, and so he had to stop and get somebody he didn't know to drive the vehicle for him so he could get in the back and try to help his son. And his 14-year-old boy died in his arms as he was trying to get him to the hospital. Does that mean that Jesus wasn't with them? He was. Jesus had another road for them to go down. Jesus had something else to do in their lives, but he was very much with them. A tremendous ministry came out of that experience where he went around and found people who went around the world interviewing persecuted Christians with the question, the one main question he asked everybody is, was it worth it? Knowing Jesus worth what you suffered, what you gave up, what you lost, whatever it was in your persecution and all that happened to you. And he said the oversounding response with that was absolutely yes. He's worth it. Sometimes God brings us through it and we can look back and we can say, it's wonderful that God spared us and saved us and did those things. Sometimes that doesn't happen that way. But in both occurrences, he's with us. Some of you have gone through life experiences and you've experienced tremendous loss. But you have the same testimony as you look back upon it because you went through it with Jesus. The clear testimony, the clear revelation of all the hurt and all the loss and all that you miss is that he was with you as he promised. We have to hurry. We experience Jesus also in the presence of serving him. You know, one of the things that Jesus makes clear in the Great Commission, he says it again, and it makes it clear again in John, the 15th chapter, the 5th verse. He tells us that without him, we can do nothing. He gives us the Great Commission to go and make disciples, and he promises, I will be with you. And one reason that's such a significant thing is that becomes the key and the ignition. That's the thing that makes it even possible to do what he's telling us to do, is the fact that he's with us and he empowers us. Another Great Commission that is recorded in the book of Acts that Jesus gives his apostles. He says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses. The Holy Spirit coming upon them is the presence of Jesus coming to be with them and in them. And that's what it made it possible for them to carry out the mission he had given them to do. He was with them. One of the hardest things of becoming a missionary, especially those early years, was learning language. And I remember I had gotten to the point where I felt like I could preach pretty good before we went to the mission field. I'd pastored for 7 years. I'd had some good mentors and people that I had followed and really learned how to preach from. Seminary had helped me. I had good tools. And I'd gotten to the point where I felt like I could hold my own preaching. And then we got over there, and I was still, learning language, so I was still preaching in English, and that was great. Well, everybody would have me come out, and I would be able to go speak at meetings and stuff. I was in demand. And I set a goal that I would be speaking in Chinyanja, the local language, at the end of 6 months, and I wouldn't preach in English anymore. I had more confidence in myself than I really should have as far as language learning, but I stayed with that, and I started preaching in Chinyanja. I remember the first sermon I preached, I had written it out. I never preached from a manuscript before, but I was told that I probably should do that in the language, so I'd have everything down. And I wrote that thing out, and I sat there and I started preaching it. And all of a sudden, I realized that I was reading words that I did not even understand. I wasn't able to interpret the words I was reading quick enough to know what I was saying, even though I had written it all out. And that was a horrible experience, to be in the middle of a sermon and not even know what I'm saying, and not even sure I'm reading the right thing. And I was just so lost. I got through with that. I was really despondent. And then as I began to preach, I started trying to be more where I would preach more out of my mind, and where that way I could look up and see people, but then I would see in their eyes that they weren't understanding a word I was saying. And I really began to bottom out. That I had left a place where I could preach and I could be understood and I could be effective, and now I was preaching in a place where a 6-year-old kid could be called up out of the audience and given a verse, and he could, beat me all to pieces and be able to communicate something about that, because I just couldn't communicate where people could hear me. And I went through a really, really hard time. And it just seemed like it wasn't getting any better. I would go out to a meeting. I used to be invited when I was preaching English, and everybody would be really excited and everything, and come up and tell me how much they got. I remember first time that happened after I started speaking in Chinyanja, I was introduced and they sent up somebody to interpret, and I said, no, I'm going to preach in Chinyanja. I mean, one of the significant leaders in the area said, Chinyanja. But, I was just really fired up, and these guys are really ready for it. But that was my early experience in preaching like that. I got asked to speak at an associational meeting in Lusaka, the capital, and I couldn't tell that I was improving at all in my preaching. I wasn't getting any kind of feedback, and it was just out there very isolated and going from church to church, and I was just kind of feeling like I was wasting a slot. But I came in and I preached at this thing, and I prepared a message for them, for those bunch of pastors and all. I told them this again. They sent up an interpreter, and I said, no, I'm going to speak in Chinyanja. And so everybody was a little bit, curious about that. And they sat down, and I began to preach. And I noticed attention in the eyes, and people following, and some people taking notes. And some of those guys, pastors, and some of the people from the seminary came up after that and talked about how much they got out of my message. And all of a sudden I realized they understood me. And they not only understood me, but they got thoughts, and they were able to, and I realized that I had come to the place without even realizing it where I could actually communicate as I preached. And that God had been using me. And I said something to one of the guys. I said, I was thinking I was just totally wasted. He said, no. So we've been hearing from out in the area about how much people enjoy getting to hear you speak and stuff. I was just amazed at that. It wasn't from any other kind of ability, but as I went out to do what God had called me to do, I knew I was doing it really badly. And I'd say things like in English, them is, and stuff like that. It was my grammar. I would hear some of it and know it was just horrible. I must have been horrible to listen to it. Very difficult to follow. But Jesus was with me, and he made me effective and enabled me to increase in that, and enabled me to have confidence so I could go ahead and go forward and have a ministry. And thirdly, we experience Christ's presence in trouble. I've got a million stories about how things went wrong and when things broke and things broke down and things happened. But one of my favorite experiences that just shows the fingerprints of Jesus all over it. We'd been to South Africa, for something, and we had a new vehicle, and fairly new, and I had not been able to get it serviced. We bought a vehicle that was from Japan, and found out after we did that everybody south of Zambia, there was an agreement between Japan and the manufacturing companies in South Africa that they would supply, South Africa would have to supply all the parts and everything for their vehicles. And you couldn't buy Japanese parts and stock them and everything in that area. Well, I had a Japanese vehicle. I didn't know that. Zambia had a horrible economy. There was no parts or anything for the vehicle in Zambia because of the economy. We drove to South Africa. I thought I was going to buy a bunch of supplies and everything, and found out there was nothing down there. I got the car worked on, and one of the things I wanted them to do was repack the front wheel bearings because I wasn't that familiar with four-wheel drive, and the hub and everything was on there. I was afraid to take all that apart to pack it, and I was always in deep water, as I knew those things needed to be cleaned and packed. And so I asked them to pack that, and so they did it. But I was not able to get any of the kind of spares, and kind of just didn't know what I was going to do with keeping that vehicle running because I couldn't get any parts for it. We drove all the way back to Zambia. Going back through Lusaka, they told me that the new president of the International Mission Board, Jerry Rankin, was going to be coming and doing an African tour. He's going to be coming to Harare in Zimbabwe. And they said, since you've been off and you stopped your work to go to South Africa, we thought you might have time to go back down there and meet him because none of the rest of us can really do it. And I said, okay, well, as long as I have time to go home and unload stuff and kind of, catch our breath, then we'll turn around and go back down if you want me to. And they said, no, we really need you to. So we got back in the car and just less than a week, and we headed back down the road and going to Harare in Zimbabwe. The roads are very, there's two places you go through there. Where we lived, to go into mountains, you actually went down into them. You'd have escarpments going down into river valleys. And it'd be kind of like crossing the Grand Canyon by driving down one side of it and crossing the river, then driving back up the other side. It wouldn't be anything near that big, but that's kind of an illustration of what it was like. You drive down to these places, you have switchbacks and roads and very crooked roads and all that stuff, crossing the Luangwa River, and then before we got down there, as we went out of Zambia, we'd have to cross the Zambezi River. It was the same thing, and especially the one on the Zambezi River was a very dangerous road. A lot of trucks coming from South Africa were on that road, and very short turns. A lot of the guardrails were gone from the side of the road where you could run off very easily. And so we went through all of that and dodged the potholes and the animals on the road and got all that. Came up the other side on the escarpment for the Zambezi River into Zimbabwe. It got up on the plateau and the road was kind of straight and you could kind of move on and make some progress once you got up there. And we were up there maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and we went through a little town by the name of Blanket. Came out on the other side of the town, went around a curve and came up behind a farm vehicle that was moving very slow and had to slam on my brakes. And when I punched on the brakes, it went completely to the floor. I don't know if any of you have ever had that experience, but it's really kind of horrifying, especially if you're coming up on something fast and you don't know if you're going to be able to get around it, if anything's coming. So I pumped the brakes real fast, and when I did, the brakes came back and it stopped the vehicle. And so I pulled over, and I said, well, something's really wrong. So hadn't been out of this town very long, so I just drove back into the town real slow, pulled up at a little service station and pulled off on the side. He got out and looked, went around on the passenger side on the left and looked at the wheel. It had grease all over it. And oh man, something really bad has happened. I took the wheel and shook it. It just flopped. It was just very loose. And so I went over to the guy who was putting fuel in a car there. Everything's still full service. So they come out and fill your car up, and he was filling a vehicle up. And I went over and I said, do you have a mechanic here? And he said, no. He said, there's a mechanic. It's just down this road here. And so I asked for directions, and I went back over, and Betty and the kids had gotten out of the car, so we were getting everybody back in the car, getting ready to go. And I said, we're going to go see a mechanic. And the car that was getting gas pulled up beside us. And a British lady got out of the car, and she said, I understand you're having some trouble. And I said, yeah. And I went over and shook the wheel for her and showed her, and she said, oh, my. I said, you've got some kind of really serious problem. She said, I just came over here to tell you not to go see the mechanic he told you about. She said, I understand you're probably a missionary. And I said, yes. She said, well, and she introduced herself. She said, we're believers. She said, my family owns a sheet metal business just down the road. And we have a good fleet of vehicles. We keep our own mechanic all the time. And said, if you'll follow me down there, I'll take you to him, and we'll pull him off of whatever he's working on and let him look at your vehicle and see what needs to be done. And so we went down there. This guy's very nice. He came out, jacked the vehicle up, took the wheel off, and looked at it. And I won't go into a lot of details to explain about the four-wheel drive vehicle, but basically everything that holds the vehicle wheel on had come loose, except for the disc brakes on the caliper holding the disc brakes in. And that's what the wheel getting crooked when it was pushing the brakes out. It made my brakes not work till I pumped them and they got back in. But that was the only thing keeping the wheel on the car. And he said, it looks like you've had somebody work on it and they didn't bend the little tab on a lock nut, a lock washer that was supposed to hold those nuts in place. And it's allowed them to work loose. And so everything has come off, and everything in this part of this wheel is ruined. And he said, it's just a miracle that your wheel didn't lock up. He said, I don't think it would have ever come off, but if it had gotten out enough, it would have locked up and you could have had a really bad accident. He said, this is just amazing that you haven't had more trouble, that you've been able to make it here and stop. And I said, well, how can I get it fixed? He said, well, this is a Japanese vehicle. And he said, I know from experience, you can't get the parts here. He said, and he started kind of talking about it. Then he said, wait a minute, come here, I got to show you something. And so we went inside, and there was a chassis of a vehicle sitting there. And he said, this is the same Nissan Patrol that you're driving. Somebody rolled it, totaled it out, the chassis, the motor, the transmission's good. I've taken it, stripped all that off, and I've had it sitting here for over a year now. As I get a little money and get all the time, I'm building a vehicle out of this. And he said, the thing that just amazes me is just about a month ago, I got in the parts of the vehicle that you're missing and put it on this vehicle. And so I've got everything you need sitting right here. And he said, if you want to buy it from me, I'll sell it to you. It's going to take me years to finish the thing. I can order it again and get it put on. And so we did that in an hour. We were on our way, and we made it to our meeting. We started going down the road, and it just started coming to me, looking in the rearview mirror. My brakes failed at exactly the place where I would turn around and go back, and I stopped at a service station where a lady just happened to be getting fuel put in her car. They could overhear me asking for a mechanic and come and ask me what my problem was, lead me to her mechanic, who happened to probably be the only person within thousands of miles, if not in that whole area of Africa, that had the spare parts that just I needed sitting there to put on my car. The very best scenario we could have come out with would have been our car would have been there for months while we waited on the parts to come. We would have been stranded for days trying to get back into Zambia. We'd have missed our meeting and all that. As it turns out, within an hour of the time he thought that, we were on our way. We made our meeting, and we made it perfectly safe. Worst case scenario, we could have ended up on the bottom of a ravine somewhere off one of those escarpments. But God was with us, as he promised he would be. I share those stories. I've gone over a little, so I'll stop. But the main point is it doesn't have to happen in Africa, with the more exotic experiences and all that makes it more memorable. But Jesus has been with you today. And you may not even know it, the miracles that he and his angels that he surrounded you with have worked to sustain your life and to use you. He uses you in life. He's with you in life, and he gets you through that in every aspect of it. He's with you as you try to serve him. And you may be scared to death to share the gospel to the guy sitting next to you on a plane or somebody in your neighborhood or something. You may feel totally inadequate, just like I felt so inadequate to preach. He's with you. And it really doesn't depend upon your skill and your ability and everything being silky smooth and done exactly right with all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. It's him that does it and accomplishes it. And you can do it because he's with you. And when you go through trouble, Psalm, the 23rd Psalm, the 4th verse says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Why? For you are with me. Does that mean that nothing tragic will ever happen to take your life or the life of your loved one? No. But even that hard thing, he goes with you into it and through it, and he sustains you. As you pray for Jacob and I as we leave Saturday to go on this trip, if you want to pray for God to be with us, that's just fine. I'll take that. But even more than that, pray that he use us, that he sustain us, that he's with us in ministry, that he's with us as we travel, as we have opportunities. He's with us in the hardship of the trip. And that he brings us back, that we might have a testimony of just how real and how wonderful we can see that all the way through, whatever, he was with us. Lord, thank you for your promise. Father, you began giving it to the Israelites in the Old Testament, and you promised them, I will never leave you or forsake you. And you brought that promise to us through Jesus. As he promises us, I am with you always. Father, help us to hold that. Help us not to forget it, but help us to remember and help us to apply it to our lives every day that we live. And Father, help us to be able to look back and be able to just see so many different ways that we realize that you were with us in Jesus and the works that you have done. And help us, Father, to be faithful to praise you for them. It's in Jesus' name we pray and for his name's sake. Amen.